We know the difference between singular and plural. I have friends that have 4 boys. They could refer to the boys as boys, and they could say them. My parents have 1 son. They can refer to me as him or he. They don't call me them or they. Singular and plural. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're looking at some covenants that God has made in the past. Our goal is to eventually work up to a covenant that Paul is going to mention here in Galatians 3, a covenant that has a relationship to you and I, or to which we are related. We will get there eventually, but I'm trying to demonstrate some things before we get there so that we can better understand the nature of a biblical covenant and the fact that, as he says here in Galatians 3:15, even if it's a human covenant, you don't set it aside. That is, you don't just say, well, I'm not going to honor that covenant. Neither do you add to that covenant. You don't do any of those things. And a covenant is, as we've been saying, a contract. And Paul makes it very pointed down here in verse 16 that this covenant consisted of promises, which we've talked about here. And those promises were to his seed or his descendants, his offspring, his great-grandkids, as it were. But he does not say unto seeds, plural. He's making a big deal about this idea that it's not a plural seed, it's a singular seed. And he says, not referring to many, but to your seed, who is Christ. It says the seed he's talking about is Christ. And therefore, we've started back over in Genesis 15, and we looked at a covenant that God made on that day in Genesis 15, a covenant which we saw up above in the context that he made with his offspring, his seed, is the Hebrew word for seed here, but it is a them, because if we come over here into the Hebrew, we have the plural pronoun attached to the preposition here. In Genesis 17, we put in today, in Genesis 17, it says, now when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram, said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Now, in the last covenant, God promised Abraham land. That was what the covenant was about. It did not say that the covenant had to do with being a multiple seed. That was actually something we could say God promised back in Genesis 12, but now he's going to be stating it in a covenant form. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you. You will be a father of a multitude of nations. Again, this is not what God promised to Abraham back in Genesis 15. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. Abram was simply had this idea of big father, exalted father. Abraham is father of peoples. Okay, father of many people. For I have made you. So this is why he's multitude of nations, and now we come down to Abraham. He says, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations, exactly as I was indicating. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. The amazing thing about this, if you go back to verse 1, he's 99 years old, and he doesn't have any kids that are fulfilling this. He has 1 son that he has produced in between, but he has none yet. He says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout. Now again, he talks about the descendants. It's seed. It's a singular, as we pointed out. It's singular here in the Hebrew, but the word there is this pronoun, this single letter at the end of this word for generations, after you, for the generations theirs, for an everlasting covenant, to be, notice this is part of the covenant now, to be a God to you and to your descendants again. We have descendants down here, your seed, we have it down here. And I will give to your descendants, your seed after you, the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be there. Again, we have Abraham now with the preposition here. Again, plural pronoun referring to seed. Now you can keep that in mind. Seed is singular in these places, but the pronoun that is referring back to the main noun, seed, is plural. And that's going to be important when we get to the covenant that God states is singular. We haven't reached that covenant yet. Now, I realize that this is different. I don't know where all of your background is, but most Christians I meet, they believe that God made a single covenant with Abraham. And yet I'm demonstrating, and please just hear me out on what we're going to be looking at here. I believe that God made 4 covenants with Abraham, and he could do that. In fact, we started that when we were looking at this short bit on covenants just a couple days ago. The fact that a person could have multiple contracts. In fact, God's going to have multiple contracts later. He's going to make a contract with Israel that's going to be called the law. Plus, they're going to inherit this contract because they're part of the seed that God was promising to Abraham. And he's going to make them a covenant later on in their history, 40 years later, about the land that they have there. So God made different covenants, and he's going to make a covenant later on in the book of Jeremiah that's going to be for their future. So right there are at least 4 covenants, if we look at it that way, that God made with the people of Israel. So yeah, God could make multiple covenants. And if we honor what Paul divinely tells us is the background for a covenant, you don't set it aside. That means you have to fulfill it, and you don't add to it. Those are the 2 things he's saying. So when we're coming to these other passages, we're looking at what these covenants are promising. We've seen one promise land. We've seen that this one promises land, but it also promises that they will be God's people. He will be their God. It's a covenant promise that he's made. So he's made some promises in these 2 covenants. Keep that in mind, because all that's going to feed together when we get down to understanding the covenant that you and I share in. And we're not, I want to be very clear on this, it's not one where we have replaced Israel. There are people that teach in one way or another that we have taken Israel's place. And that is not what Paul is going to suggest when he puts this together. God's covenants with Israel are still valid. There are aspects of some of his covenants that have yet to be fulfilled. They're in the future. He will fulfill those, I believe, literally for the people of Israel. But there's also a covenant that's going to include you and I. And we're going to look at that here eventually. I hope that this is helpful. I realize it's kind of stretching, and for some of you it may be different than the way you've learned the idea of biblical covenants. But I think it reflects what Paul states here in Galatians, and I believe it's honoring to those different texts that we're looking at back there in Genesis. And I hope that this is helpful. Stick with me, and hopefully we'll get around to eventually looking at the covenant that we are a part of. Thank you for joining me today, and as always, have a good day in the Lord.